The year 1823 dawned on a world map being redrawn by revolution. To the south of the young United States, the vast colonial empires of Spain and Portugal lay in fragments, shattered by decades of bloody insurrection. From the pampas of Argentina to the mountains of Mexico, new republics had declared their hard-won sovereignty, their flags still fresh, their borders still contested. Yet this birth of nations was watched with cold, imperial eyes from across the Atlantic. In the chancelleries of Europe, the Holy Alliance, a conservative compact of monarchies led by Russia, Prussia, and Austria, viewed these upstart democracies as a dangerous contagion. Whispers circulated of a grand design to reclaim the lost colonies, to restore by force of arms the gilded crowns of Madrid and Lisbon. The very idea of republicanism was an affront to the divine right of kings, and the New World's experiment hung in a precarious balance. In Washington, a city of muddy roads and grand, unfinished ambitions, President James Monroe presided over a republic itself only 4 decades old. His was a nation cautiously confident, its own revolutionary fires banked but still warm, its gaze turning westward even as it glanced nervously eastward across the ocean. The news from Europe was disquieting. Reports suggested that France, with the blessing of the alliance, might soon send armies to crush the new American states. For Monroe and his cabinet, the question was not merely diplomatic but existential. Should the United States, a nation still consolidating its own power, dare to issue a pronouncement on the fate of an entire hemisphere? The air in the White House study was thick with tobacco smoke and grave deliberation. The debate centered on 2 formidable intellects. Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, son of a president and a diplomat of granite principle and glacial patience, argued for a bold, unilateral declaration. He saw the moment not as a crisis but as an epical opportunity. The United States, he insisted, must seize the rhetorical high ground, framing European intervention not as a matter of realpolitik but as a fundamental threat to American safety and Republican ideals. He distrusted the British, who, despite sharing an interest in checking Spanish restoration, pursued their own commercial empire. Adams wanted a purely American policy, free from the appearance of being a British satellite. Conversely, others, including some in Monroe's inner circle, urged caution. The nation's military was small, its navy no match for the combined fleets of Europe. A declaration without the power to enforce it was mere bravado, they warned, a provocation that could draw the young republic into wars it could not win. Yet as the autumn leaves turned, the pressure for a definitive statement grew. President Monroe, a veteran of the Revolution who carried the scars of war, understood the symbolic power of words. He weighed the risks of action against the longer-term peril of inaction. To stand silent while European monarchies carved up the hemisphere anew would be an abdication of the very principles upon which his own country was founded. The cabinet meetings stretched long into the candlelit evenings, the fate of continents being shaped in quiet, urgent conversation. They were crafting more than a foreign policy memo. They were preparing to draw a line in the sand of history, to declare that the age of New World colonization was over, and that a new era of American guardianship, however nascent and ill-defined, was about to begin. The stage was set for a message to Congress that would echo far beyond the Capitol's walls. On December 2, 1823, President James Monroe stood before the Congress of the United States to deliver his 7th annual message. The document was a lengthy compilation of domestic concerns and routine diplomatic updates, but nestled within its paragraphs lay a seismic declaration. It was not labeled a doctrine at the time. That moniker would come later, bestowed by history. In that moment, it was simply the reasoned policy of a republic stating its position to the world. Yet the words, carefully calibrated by Monroe and his Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, carved out a new geopolitical reality. They articulated 2 core, interlocking principles that would forever alter the relationship between the Americas and Europe. The first principle was a stark prohibition on future colonization. The United States, the address declared, would consider any attempt by European powers to extend their system to any portion of the Western Hemisphere as dangerous to its peace and safety. The continents of North and South America, having achieved and maintained a condition of free and independent sovereignty, were henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European power. This was the non-colonization clause, a clear and deliberate drawing of a line. It was a forward-looking decree aimed particularly at Russia's ambitions in the Pacific Northwest and any potential designs by the Holy Alliance on the former Spanish territories. The statement transformed the hemisphere from a map of colonial opportunity into a closed space, its political development deemed complete. The second principle addressed the present. The message stated that the political system of the Allied European powers was essentially different from that of the Americas. The United States would regard any interposition by those powers for the purpose of oppressing the newly independent states, or controlling their destiny in any other manner, as the manifestation of an unfriendly disposition toward the United States itself. This was the non-interference clause, a shield for the fledgling republics to the south. It framed European intervention not merely as a transatlantic affair, but as a direct threat to American security and republican ideals. The doctrine made clear that while the United States had not interfered and would not interfere with existing European colonies, the era of European dominion over independent American nations was irrevocably over. Beneath these explicit pronouncements thrummed a powerful, implied third element, the assertion of a unique American role as hemispheric protector. Doctrine positioned the United States as the arbiter and guarantor of the new order, a self-appointed guardian standing between the Old World's monarchical past and the New World's republican future. This role was assumed unilaterally, without consultation with the very nations it purported to shield. It was a statement of breathtaking ambition, declaring a sphere of influence not through military might, which the nation still lacked, but through the sheer force of political will and ideological conviction. The address framed this stance not as aggression, but as a defensive necessity, a natural extension of the nation's own revolutionary birthright and geographic destiny. In that Capitol Hall, a profound shift was codified, moving the United States from a peripheral player on the world stage to the central authority of its own continental sphere. The immediate international reception of Monroe's declaration was a mixture of indifference, skepticism, and quiet relief. In the courts of Europe, the pronouncement was largely dismissed as an irrelevance, the bluster of a minor power without the fleet or army to back its bold words. The Holy Alliance, preoccupied with suppressing liberal revolutions at home, ultimately lacked the collective will for a transatlantic crusade. More significantly, the British Royal Navy, enforcing its own policy of opposing Spanish restoration for commercial reasons, acted as an unwitting enforcer of the American principle. The doctrine in its infancy was a paper shield, its strength derived less from American power than from the existing balance of European rivalries. Yet in the capitals of Latin America, the message was received with cautious gratitude. For leaders like Simón Bolívar, it was a welcome, if self-interested, deterrent, a diplomatic barrier against the specter of returning European armies. Within the United States, the doctrine's long-term foundational impact unfolded slowly, like a seed germinating in deep soil. It was not an instant creed. For decades, it remained a dormant statement, occasionally referenced but rarely invoked as a guide for action. Its power lay in its plasticity and its profound resonance with the growing national identity. It provided a coherent foreign policy framework that married strategic interest with ideological purpose. The doctrine framed the Western Hemisphere as a distinct sphere, separate and inherently different from the Old World, a concept that fed the burgeoning sense of American exceptionalism. It transformed the United States from a mere nation among nations into the custodian of a continental destiny, planting the idea that its security and its principles were inextricably linked to the political fate of its neighbors. This early role as a hemispheric shield, however, contained the embryo of a more assertive future. By declaring the Americas closed to European intervention, the doctrine implicitly assigned the United States the responsibility of maintaining that closure. It established a precedent for unilateral action, setting the stage for the nation to define threats to hemispheric stability on its own terms. In the 1840s, the spirit of the doctrine was invoked to justify westward expansion, framing the annexation of Texas and the war with Mexico as acts of continental consolidation that preempted European meddling. The shield was beginning to be used to justify the sword of American ambition. The direct line from the 1823 doctrine to the Roosevelt corollary of 1904 is unmistakable. When President Theodore Roosevelt declared that chronic wrongdoing by Latin American nations might require the United States to exercise an international police power, he was not abandoning Monroe's principles but logically and aggressively extending them. The corollary filled the enforcement vacuum that had always existed at the doctrine's core. If European intervention was forbidden, Roosevelt argued, then the United States had both the right and the duty to intervene itself to prevent the conditions that might invite European action. The protective shield of 1823 was thus transformed into a license for preemptive intervention. The doctrine's original aim of guarding sovereign states from external empires evolved into a rationale for overseeing their internal affairs. From a defensive proclamation grew an interventionist policy, the foundational stone upon which a century of American hegemony in the hemisphere would be built. The words spoken in 1823, born of caution and aspiration, had hardened into a cornerstone of national power.